Ever since the first arrival of Chinese immigrants in the 1800s, Asian Americans have been attacked and discriminated against for a variety of reasons throughout American history. From mobs and massacres against Chinese miners to random Asians being beat up and assaulted on America's streets, violence and hatred against Asian Americans have not stopped and could never stop in the foreseeable future. As we see with the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, even to this day, Asian Americans cannot rest without asking, am I going to get hurt because of my race? Today, we will look at the history of violence against Asian Americans and try to find patterns in these crimes to get a better understanding of when these crimes could potentially occur in the future. You most likely know of the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment, but have you heard of the many massacres involving Chinese workers? Or the KKK's war against Vietnamese shrimpers? Let's begin with the first time period, Chinese arrival and American prosperity.
When the first Chinese immigrants arrived in the 1800s, they sought an economic opportunity to support their families back home in China. They worked many jobs like ore mining, laundry, and most famously, railroad construction for the Transcontinental Railroad. Due to their hard work in achieving success, they became a target for those who were jealous of their success. The case of People v. Hall, 1853. People v. Hall was one of the first occurrences of violence against Asians in America. 3 protesters attacked a Chinese miners' camp in California. 1 Chinese worker was injured, but another was killed in the ordeal. The 3 protesters were arrested, but due to Supreme Court of California ruling that the Chinese people cannot be witnesses in legal trials, the 3 were found not guilty of their crimes. The Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871. You may not have heard about this massacre because no educational systems contained this in their curriculum. In 1871, in what is now modern-day Chinatown, 2 Chinese men were disputing over the kidnapping of a Chinese woman. Shots began to ring out, and unfortunately, a police officer was shot, and a respected salon owner was killed in the crossfire when they were trying to break up the fight. Word then got out of the Chinese men were killing white men, so the surrounding neighborhoods mobbed together to take revenge for the killing. On the night of the 24th of October, around 500 people came into Los Angeles, Chinatown, to rob and kill. One of the Chinese men had his fingers cut off so that the mob could take his ring. In the aftermath, 17 to 20 people were found dead. Many victims were no older than 18 and were well respected in their community. A large number of people were arrested for their involvement and some were found guilty, but they all had their verdicts overturned. Xenophobia began to arise after this incident, which ultimately led to the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Another massacre you may not have heard about was the Rock Springs Massacre in 1885. Coal and mining companies wanted to boost profit while cutting losses, so they began to cut the wages of their workers. The Chinese workers did not mind so long as they made money, but the white workers saw this as a possibility of losing their jobs. Seeing the Chinese workers as a threat to their livelihoods, they began putting up signs telling the Chinese to get out of town. Many did not want to leave their homes, so they stayed to continue their lives. On September 2nd, a fight broke out between white workers and Chinese workers, which resulted in the death of 1 Chinese worker. Later in the day, 150 men armed with rifles came to the town of Rock Springs and surrounded the town. As some Chinese residents began leaving, the armed men began shooting into the town. When the day ended, 28 bodies were confirmed killed, but it is estimated that the death toll could be around 40 to 50 people, and that many bodies were unaccounted for. The damage down in the town is estimated to be around $4.5 million in today's dollars. No one was legally charged for their involvement, but they were fired from their jobs. Although there were people arrested, they could not testify because there were no witnesses. For the Chinese that did flee, they fled to high lands to not be seen by the mob. It wasn't until a week later that federal troops escorted the escaped Chinese residents back to their town, but the damage was already done. No later than a week after the previous massacre, another group of armed individuals attacked a group of Chinese workers for the very same reason. In Washington state, 37 Chinese workers were hired on a farm for cheap labor. This angered the white and native workers, who then retaliated by threatening the workers to leave. When they didn't, on September 7th, they coordinated an attack on the housing of the Chinese workers. In an instant, they fired into the tents of the workers, killing 3 workers and injuring another 3. Out of 8 suspects, 3 were arrested for their involvement in the shooting. Although evidence proved they committed the crimes, the jury took only 30 minutes to find all 3 men not guilty.
Japanese internment is one of the most famous instances of the American government turning against its Asian population. You all may know a lot about these camps, like how they housed a ton of Japanese American citizens to work in factories for the war. However, there lies more than meets the eye as the violence began to brew in these camps. In one instance, after being dropped off by train, detainees had to walk miles towards their camp. As they were marching, 2 men were shot by guards as they were, quote, trying to escape, end quote. The 2 men were an elderly man and a disabled man. In another case, an elderly man was walking near the outer fencing of a camp and was shot. A few months later, a couple was killed for the same reason. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered to the Allied powers, effectively ending the Second World War. Japanese internment would continue even after the war, until March 1946. This event was truly something in American history. Basically, after the war, a bunch of South Vietnamese refugees fled to the United States, and some became shrimpers or fishers. Many of them settled in Galveston Bay, Texas. However, many white supremacists saw their new neighbors as economic threats. In 1979, a fight broke out between a white and a Vietnamese fisherman, which resulted in the white fisherman being killed. Hours later, Vietnamese fishing boats were set on fire, and a crabbing plant that hired Vietnamese workers was bombed. When the Vietnamese fisherman who killed the white fisherman went to court, he was found not guilty due to self-defense. The father of the white fisherman did not like the news and stated, "So long as there is one left in a fishing town on this Gulf Coast, there is going to be trouble. There is going to be a war." End quote. The news garnered the attention of the Ku Klux Klan, who vowed to eliminate every Vietnamese person in the area. Some of the Klan members were anti-communists who fought in the Vietnam War. Ironically, they fought actual communists in Vietnam, but vowed to kill anti-communists who fled their country. They trained with military tactics, assault rifles, and grenades to kill people of all age groups. The Klan gave the Vietnamese population a deadline to leave. Prior to the deadline, they intimidated the population in a variety of ways. 1. They lit 2 fishing boats on fire who were owned by Vietnamese fishermen. 2. They impaled a coconut, which was carved to make it look like a human head, on a Vietnamese person's lawn and draped the Confederate flag behind it. 3. One guy pulled up to 2 Vietnamese fishers and waved his gun in front of them. And 4. They burned crosses on Vietnamese lawns. In one case, a group of Klan members even hanged a human effigy on their boat and patrolled near the head of the Vietnamese Fishers Association. Of course, many Vietnamese people were scared for their lives, so they tried to sell their assets like their houses and their boats, but some were unable to do so. These intimidation tactics would continue for weeks. In the end, Vietnamese fishermen teamed up with the Southern Poverty Law Center to sue those involved in the hate crimes. As for the verdict, the judge issued 2 orders. 1. To end the harassment of Vietnamese fishers, and 2. To close all the military-style training camps that the Klan used to train their members. The Vietnamese achieved victory on the legal battlefield, but at what cost? Although the harassment ended, many lost their homes, jobs, a sense of security and peace from those who fought for their side in the war. The war that side failed to win. On the night of June 19th, 1982, Vincent Chin, a Chinese American, went out to a strip club with his friends to celebrate his upcoming wedding. During this time, Japan was increasing its effectiveness in car production. Detroit, the old automobile capital of America, was declining. This put many Americans out of work. At the club, a stripper recalled two men shouting the chin, saying, "It's because of you, mother that we're out of work." They were workers at Chrysler. When he was heading home, the two men beat him up, thinking he was of Japanese ancestry. He ran away and tried to escape from them, but was caught, and they beat him up with a baseball bat. Unfortunately, he died 4 days later from his injuries. In regards to the punishment and justice for these two individuals, the two men received a $3,000 fine and 3 years probation with no jail time. This light sentence enraged the Asian American community, and civil rights groups began to form. Through legal battles and determination, the two men were punished for their heinous crimes. One was sentenced to 25 years but was released after a retrial. The other one was required to pay the Chin family $50,000 for the next 10 years. The first guy who got out of jail was ordered to pay $1.5 million, but he failed to pay it all, and it accrued interest. Many Americans were heavily affected and devastated by the September 11th attacks against the United States. Many emotions entered the mind of almost every American. Some were filled with sadness, but some were filled with anger and hatred. Many of these filled with anger and hatred attacked their fellow Americans, thinking they were the enemy. Mark Anthony Stroman was one of these Americans. Filled with hatred, he attacked 3 men who he thought were all from the Middle East. They were all South Asian. Stroman was an avid white supremacist, so it was not a surprise when he was executed by the state of Texas 10 years after his killing spree. Around this time, a Sikh man named Balbir Singh Sodhi was planting flowers outside of his gas station, when suddenly, a man pulled up next to him and shot 5 rounds into Sodhi, killing him. The man then went to another gas station to shoot at a Lebanese clerk and into the home of an Afghan family. He missed both times, thankfully. In 2004, a Yale professor estimated that there were almost 17 more Sikhs, Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians who were killed in retaliation for the September 11th attacks. Following the arrival of the coronavirus, many Americans began to turn their hatred towards the Chinese once again, like a cycle. Videos of Asian Americans being attacked circulated and spread around the internet like the virus itself. Common targets included elderly Asian people simply going home or doing chores. Attacks were random and sporadic. These attacks were so bad that Congress passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which increased resources to collect data on hate crimes. Although it did not prevent hate crimes from happening, it was most definitely a step forward to understanding why people committed such acts. Due to its recent nature and occurrences, we do not have many statistics on all victims and incidents. However, through the lens of social media, it is obvious that there were sporadic attacks against Asian Americans due to the COVID-19 pandemic. As we have learned from this video, the Asian American population has been persecuted since the day they landed on American soil. We see that during times of crises, or times when people feel threatened by Asian Americans, people turn to violence to feel less threatened. The violence went from mobs attacking towns, to the government imprisoning an ethnic population, then to isolated attacks against a certain ethnic group. Unfortunately, the hatred against Asians in America does not seem to simmer down in the near future. So long as there is crisis related to Asians, there will be discrimination that follows. However, it is important that we learn and recognize the past crimes against Asian Americans. Our recognition of these problems will help pave a way for the next generation to not experience the trauma that previous generations faced. For as they say, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it.